Okay, and that has started now. So welcome everybody. Oh, hello, Hazel. Thanks for being here. My name's Haley. I'm with the Endangered Species Coalition, and we're really excited to offer y'all this 8th Habitat Connectivity Spotlight hosted by the Western Slope Connectivity Project, which is a project of the Endangered Species Coalition. And I am the Southern Rockies field representative for that organization. And our mission is to stop the human-caused extinction of our nation's most at-risk species. And we believe habitat connectivity is a pivotal part of stopping extinction, increasing biodiversity, making us a resilient community, both human and non-human communities. So I'm really excited to be a part of this presentation tonight. And, you know, we're going to hand it over to Elizabeth and Paul in just a second. But before we do that, I wanted to share a short story or really just relate, because when I saw the title of this spotlight for tonight that Elizabeth and Paul put together, you know, thinking about recreation and habitat connectivity, and immediately came to mind my favorite place to go camping on the Western Slope, which is outside of Leadville. And it's a really popular campsite. And I mean, it's beautiful. And I love it because it's, you know, it's up a little ways up a 4-wheel drive road. So there's not too many people. It's right by a beautiful creek. And it's just spectacular. But, you know, every time we go, I always end up picking up a ton of trash. There's people digging cat holes, and they're not well done cat holes. And it's really disappointing. And I think that recreation is a beautiful tool for advocacy and, you know, to make our world a better place. But I also think that recreation can be really harmful. So I'm really excited to hear from Paul tonight and hear more about habitat connectivity and maybe ways that we can do it a little better moving forward. So I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth to introduce Paul and kind of get us going for tonight. So thank you everybody for being here.
Thank you, Haley. Paul, I'm going to give you a heads up that I'm going to actually turn to you to introduce yourself tonight, if you're okay with that.
Not a problem.
Okay. My name is Elizabeth Manis. I work with Haley on the Western Slope Connectivity Project. We are a group of citizen activists, and we advocate for and try to raise awareness, and actually succeed, I think, in raising awareness about the importance of connectivity on the Western Slope and throughout Colorado, but in particular on the Western Slope. We try to reach out to local government, elected officials in local government, and also at the state level. And we're making some headway with that. We have been holding these spotlights since June, and it's just part of what we're doing to spread the word and spread awareness and just get people involved, citizens of all kinds to get involved with this. I wanted to not tell a story about recreating, but about a boy I read about in the New York Times, which publishes a supplement every month geared toward children. And the most recent one was, they gathered a group of children in Cincinnati at an elementary school, and the question put to them was, what's the first thing you would do as president? And I was reading this to Haley yesterday. A boy named Eddie Marcos Juan, who's 8 years old, says, I would stop people from cutting down trees and building stuff in the places where animals live. Some animals help us, and when the woods are cut down, animals have to move to other places, and sometimes they get run over in the street. We need to protect them by keeping their homes safe. And I wish and hope that there are more children like Eddie throughout the state of Colorado who can do whatever they do and do it with wildlife and their homes in mind. So we are really happy to have with us tonight Paul Millhouser, and I wanted to have him introduce himself because I think that I've given a lot of these introductions, and I think Paul has a good feel for how to emphasize, what to emphasize. And so I'm going to turn it over to him. He is a GIS specialist, and he's going to tell you about his background, how he got to where he is tonight. Over to you, Paul.
All right. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Let me see if I can get some screen sharing going here. So give me 1 second to make that happen. And all right, let's see. All right, hopefully everyone can see a cover slide that says disappearing elk loving our wild places to death. And so first of all, thanks for having me here. I'm always pleased to talk about what I do, and this is a great organization that Elizabeth is part of, and Endangered Species Coalition, of course, are old friends. So I'm a landscape ecologist and GIS specialist, and what does that mean? Well, I study ecology, but at the landscape level. So I'm not looking at little processes, I'm looking at big processes and movements. The work I'm talking about tonight was actually both a work project for my employer, Rocky Mountain Wild, and it was also my master's thesis. And just to put in a pitch for Rocky Mountain Wild, it's a small nonprofit that fights to protect wildlife and wild places throughout the Southern Rockies. And a lot of our work involves pushing back on oil and gas development, especially on federal lands, and especially when endangered species or critical habitats at stake. We also do a lot of mapping and other analysis to support other nonprofits who are working in the area. And at the moment, we're working on getting a wildlife crossing structure, or actually several, built across I-70 at Dale Pass. So, and we're here talking about connectivity and wildlife movement. That would certainly be a key enhancement of that in that area. But tonight, I'm going to mostly be talking about my research, which happened really in the Roaring Fork and Eagle Valleys. But I think it has a lot of relevance to what's going on across the state. Because fundamentally, what I'm talking about is how we affect the wild places that we love, and sometimes in ways we haven't even thought of. I'm pretty sure that everyone here, myself included, would describe themselves as nature lovers, but we're all, of course, having at least some negative effect on the natural world. And maybe we don't always even understand what kinds we're having. So, well, back in 2017, I saw some news stories where the Colorado Department of Parks and Wildlife had identified an alarming decline in elk populations in the Roaring Fork and Eagle Valleys. And I think probably most people know the area here. That's where Aspen and Vail are, as well as a lot of pretty wild areas. Several people mentioned this to me as an issue that really could use investigation, because everyone seemed to think that human activity, especially development, was the cause, but no one had really studied the data and figured out if that was in fact the case. So I did a little bit of preliminary investigation and talked to some folks at CPW, and indeed, it turned out has been an elk population decline of about 50% over a 20-year period. And there's also a trend of fewer births, or fewer births and recruitments into the herd, so calves that survive a year or more, which suggests that the population is going to have a hard time recovering and could decline even further. And anecdotally, the experts, the hunters, the local citizens, and other people on the ground did indeed think development was a major contributor. So this seemed worth investigating. So just a quick roadmap of what I'll be talking about. I'll show you a few maps of the study area, which should be pretty familiar to, I think, most people here. And then we need to talk a little bit about exactly what's happened with the elk change, population change in a little bit more detail, and think about the kinds of things that might have caused its decline. And then look a little further into what the human effects on the landscapes are and how that may have affected the population. We'll talk a little bit about habitat fragmentation and what that is and what effects that might be having in this area. And then after considering all these things that might be causing changes in the elk population, I'll tell you a little bit about my analysis that hopefully gives us a better idea of what's actually causing those changes. And I'll tell you about what that modeling work tells us, and what it makes us think about future possibilities. So with that, let's just go straight forward into the maps. So here's a map of Colorado, and sort of centered in on those this sort of the central mountains there. And we zoom in, you can see that the Roaring Fork and Eagle Valleys are right there in the middle of that red circled area. And they flow through, both public and private lands. A lot of the area is part of the White River National Forest, but places like Vail and Aspen are also there. And when you add up this total area, it's 2 big watersheds, and each one's the home to a pretty substantial elk herd. So my formal study area included these 2 data analysis units, as CPW calls them, and each of those is roughly corresponding to one of those herds. And together, that's really most of those watersheds that are south of 70. And 70 is a pretty hard barrier to the north because there's no way for the herds to cross it anymore, pending creation of these crossing structures. All right, so let's see what happened with the elk population change. So this chart just shows the population changes from 1981 to 2018. As you can see, it varied pretty substantially over that 40-year period. Essentially, there was a very high growth rate during the 1980s, and the population more than doubled in 10 years, and came up to just over 19,000, and basically spent about 10 years at a plateau of around 19 or 20,000. Given the length of time it was there, I'm going to suggest that that was probably roughly the carrying capacity of the area. And when I say carrying capacity in this case, that's really just the number of individuals of the species that can exist in this area without having a really negative effect on the species or on the environment generally. But then, starting around 1999, there's a change. The population starts declining pretty precipitously, and it kept on declining right up and through 2016. And then in more recent years, it's edged up a little bit. So we have to wonder what's going on, because if there's the kind of capacity in the species to have increased so rapidly over 10 years to such a high population, what caused it to decline, and why is it staying down? Well, if we put another line on the graph representing development of the area, that might give us a little insight. And in this case, the measure I use is based on just how many square feet of construction there are in the study area at any given time. So I think what you can see here that's interesting is that during the 80s, while that population increase was going on, development was increasing too. And indeed, it really ramped up through the 90s when the population was at its peak. And that's, that eased off a little bit after the economy soured in 2008, but still pretty substantial. So it's not clear that there's really any particular relationship between what's going on with the population and the development. Certainly, it's not a simple one-to-one kind of correlation. And so this doesn't really help us understand why the population started declining in 1999, but I actually have a pretty good idea of what did. That's when Colorado Parks and Wildlife decided to start issuing more hunting licenses in the area. And fair enough, they probably thought that 20,000 elk could support increased hunting. But the resulting population decline, I think, surprised them maybe. It was a little faster than expected. So they pulled back on that increase in hunting licenses by 2005. The decline leveled off briefly, which is about what you'd expect. But then it resumed and has really carried on to almost the present day. It's certainly bounced back a little bit, but it's not heading, or doesn't seem to be heading anywhere near where that peak was back in the 90s. So let's think about what actually determines elk population and what their sort of natural growth rate is like. If there aren't any real limiting factors, elk have the capacity to increase their population 20% or even a bit more a year. And that's really because every adult female is capable of producing one calf every year. And the survival rate is normally pretty high. So the failure of the population to climb back up for 20 years really does demand an explanation. So here are some of the things that I think we normally think of as possibly having a negative influence on elk population. Certainly predation is a factor, but unfortunately we don't have great data on predation. And here I'm talking about predation by other animals, not by humans. And there's certainly no indication though that it's increased so substantially that it would account for this level of population change. That would be a pretty drastic change that there hasn't really been any indication of. And in the same way, disease, chronic wasting disease is a real problem in some parts of Colorado, but it hasn't been a huge issue, at least during that time period in the study area. So it doesn't seem like that's could be driving that sort of decrease in the population. Now, when you look at something like starvation, we're really talking about a combination of either inadequate food or inadequate access to food. So I was able to get at that a little bit by looking at things like annual precipitation, snowfall and snowpack, and measures of the health of the vegetation in the study area during those time periods. So there's really good weather data that's maintained by some state agencies. And I also was able to look at satellite data that gave me a lot of information about how the vegetation that the elk need is doing. Finally, or not finally, but maybe less obviously, the higher the elk population, the lower the growth rate. So as that population moves up towards the carrying capacity, the growth slows down, the population reaches an equilibrium, and it remains there until another factor comes along and tilts the balance. So that's likely why we saw that plateau in the population in the 90s. As the elk get up against that carrying capacity, they just reproduced a little less. It doesn't really explain what's going on with the sustained decline in population. And so one of the things we have observed is reduced fertility. CPW has noted that. And of course, the question that begs is what could be causing that? And do humans have something to do with it? So I think the first two factors here are pretty easy for everyone to understand. And wildlife vehicle collisions are a very real problem, but there just aren't enough to drive this kind of population change. It's not negligible, but it's pretty small. And there's lots of reasons for wanting to address them, but it's not really the main problem here. Hunting is certainly a factor, obviously. And luckily, we have very good data on that from CPW, not just on how many elk are killed in the hunt each year, but the numbers of different sexes and ages, and also that kind of information about population. So that's really helpful in the analysis. And we can, hunting has a role, but hunting levels other than that 5-year period have been pretty static. So they don't necessarily do a great job of explaining why that ongoing decline happened. Now, other human activities, besides hunting, like hiking, biking, ATVing, snowmobiling, et cetera, we simply don't have a great idea of what's going on in the national forest, which is most of the area. Is there more now than there was 20 years ago? I think almost everyone would absolutely agree that there is, but we don't have any numbers that we can analyze for that. Forest Service simply hasn't kept very good records, even of the total number of people visiting the national forest, much less what parts of the forest they're using and what they're doing there. So unfortunately, we can't directly analyze that. There's some chance that it roughly paralleled the increase in development. So maybe we can get at it a little bit that way, but not as directly as we'd like. But there's also the possibility of landscape changes and how the development is affecting that. And so let's talk a little bit more about how development affects the landscape and how that affects the elk. So basically, you'll hear two kinds of issues raised, and one of them is the effect of habitat fragmentation. The other is the loss of landscape connectivity, and they're closely related. So if you think of habitat loss in general, well, a house that's built or a road that's built, well, obviously the footprint of those things is no longer habitat, but the impact goes a lot farther. Even when the direct habitat loss isn't great, like a 2-lane road through the forest, that road affects a zone around it, making it less desirable for wildlife to be in. So these roads and other human constructions are carving the landscape into smaller and smaller pieces. And also those roads and development make moving between those pieces harder. So the creation of the smaller pieces is habitat fragmentation, and the limitations to movement is typically thought of as loss of connectivity. And I'll usually just talk about habitat fragmentation for simplicity's sake, but the question becomes, why are they such problems? Well, let's think a little bit about what habitat's about. I think everyone understands that habitat is just a part of the environment in which a particular species lives, feeds, and reproduces. But in fact, most species require more than a single type of habitat to meet all their needs. So in the case of elk, they need different habitats for winter and summer feeding. And they also need different habitats for calving. Although those habitats overlap, there's some pretty distinct areas as well. And even when you're considering preferred habitat types, they're not all created equal. Some habitat may have higher quality graze or better cover from predators or hunters. And that's obviously beneficial. And then others are simply larger, and both of those tend to be able to support larger populations of elk. So as those patches get smaller and smaller, the connections between them become even more important. But of course, they're being worsened at the same time. So it's definitely a real problem for elk, as well as a lot of other species. And when we think about the kinds of things that cause it, there are actually a lot of factors that contribute to it. Some are natural and some are human created. I don't think we always think of natural phenomena as fragmenting habitat, but it does. Even the transition from forest to grasslands can be a pretty steep barrier if for species like a forest dwelling toad. A wide grassland is going to be essentially impassable to them. But there are also more dramatic ones that affect animals like elk. So really steep slopes or major rivers, things like that have always broken up the habitat for them. They've always had to contend with that. The problem is now we're adding additional barriers for them. So I think this kind of scene of area being cleared and houses built and roads put in is sort of a classic view of what we might think of as man-made or human-made fragmentation. But even agricultural areas, something as simple as putting in a fence can have an effect on fragmentation and movement. And yes, I know that is a deer and not an elk. I couldn't find a good picture of an elk near a fence. And even in areas with almost no other development, like the national forest, just putting a road through can still cause that kind of fragmentation that worries us. Now you might say in this photo, well, there's an elk crossing the road. And in your own experience, you might see elk on the road all the time. So that might make you wonder, is this really a problem? Is it really causing fragmentation? And the short answer is yes. The longer answer is that fragmentation is a continuum. So in the case of elk, a divided highway, a high enough fence, or a major river would be an almost complete barrier to them. But smaller roads and even trails still affect their movement more on a behavioral level. So depending on the type and intensity of use along a road or trail, elk are going to avoid an area if they can from maybe 100 yards on either side of that road or trail to up to a half mile, depending on how busy that road or trail is and what the surrounding landscape's like. Now, when they do need to cross, like this elk does, they're going to pay a penalty. They're going to spend more time being alert, which means less time spent feeding. And it also means increased level of stress hormones, which places a higher demand on their metabolism. And there have been studies, actually fecal studies of elk in different areas and showing that the corticosteroids are much higher in these areas. So it's a real thing, and it certainly decreases their fitness. So, and there's mixed data saying that maybe non-motorized trails aren't as bad as motorized ones, but they certainly still have an effect. So let's take a look at this map, which is just an overlay on the study area of different kinds of seasonal elk habitat that's been mapped out by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And all you need to take away from this is that the blue areas are different kinds of winter habitat, and they're typically along the river valleys and at lower altitudes, the kind of places where people like to build. And then the green areas are summer habitat. And finally, those sort of purplish areas that are called production areas, those are calving areas. So areas where cows are going to be around the time of giving birth and maybe for a period afterwards. So in general, in this area, we think of those winter habitat areas and production areas as the limiting factors on our populations. If there's not enough food for them to make it through the winter, we're going to see a population decrease, whereas there's plenty of habitat for the summertime. Well, this map shows the fragmenting effect of roads and trails as of 1990. And so they're depicted in white, and their thickness is based on the type of road or trail. So you can see that even by 1990, this is a pretty rugged region, but there is a lot of roads and trails here. There's just quite a lot, especially when you consider that a big chunk of the area is national forest where construction is going to be limited. And again, remember that each of these renders a disturbed zone around it as unsuitable or less suitable habitat. And you can see, I think, that those winter habitat areas are really bearing the brunt of the fragmentation. Now, if we move forward in time to about 2018, we can see that the fragmentation's increased further, mostly by increasing the density of the already developed areas. So if you go back and forward, you can see how that's coming in. And that's not surprising because most of the remaining undeveloped land is in the national forest. But I think what you see is those areas of winter habitat have really been hammered. So let's go back briefly to what things looked like without development. And here's 2018. And that's a pretty stark difference, I would say. So that leads me to the hypothesis that human development and the resulting habitat fragmentation are reducing elk's population growth rate. So how do we test that? Well, essentially, I was going to have to look at all the possible causes of population change and look at those in different combinations and try to understand what could be causing it. And that's where statistics became my friend. So it's time to test the hypothesis. And really the first step was doing a little thought experiment and thinking about all the different ways that both natural causes and human influence causes could be affecting the population growth rate. And so those human impacts that we know we can measure are in red. So that's hunting and changes to the landscape. And sort of theorizing about maybe they are affecting access to seasonal habitat, and they're perhaps making calving areas less accessible. And that's really what's maybe driving both possibly a decline in birth rate and an increased mortality. So if we go forward, it was time to do some analysis and modeling and see if that little thought experiment actually held water. Really what I did was focus on predicting the next year's growth rate from what we knew about the current year. So that meant using software to look at all of the different factors for which I had data in every possible combination, and sort of trying to find what the best predictor is. Using software was a real advantage because not just because it works a lot faster, but also it could try every possible combination. And if I was doing it by hand, I probably would have focused on just the ones that I thought most likely. And you can definitely lose information that way. But there's still an important role of the human, because I had to go in and also verify that these models made sense, that they corresponded with what we understand about elk behavior and elk's life cycle. So after that, we got results. So again, here's the hypothesis, and let's see what I actually found. Well, when I try to predict following year growth rate for the entire period for which I had data, 1981 to 2018, really all I needed to make a pretty good prediction was the previous year's elk population. And remember that increased elk population causes the growth rate to decline. So that makes sense. And those minuses in front of each of those factors is just indicating that they have a negative effect on the growth rate. But development was the other key factor. And that's really all that I needed. So hypothesis confirmed, all done. Well, not quite. Models aren't perfect. And I wanted to understand what was missing from this one. It's great to confirm the hypothesis, but if I don't really understand what's causing it, these effects, it's not going to be very helpful to wildlife managers who are making decisions about how to help that elk population. So the first thing to notice is that this model only explains about 70% of the variation in that growth rate, which for an ecological model is actually really good, but there's still a lot of other factors. Surprisingly, things like predation, hunting, weather-related effects didn't show up, and it seems only common sense that they must play some role. So I think they must be, in that 30% that's not covered by the model. It's just not in a way that the data available or statistics could tease out. The other possibility is those factors haven't varied a lot from year to year. So they may sort of set the limits of the growth rate, but they don't actually affect how it varies so much from year to year. But I think the real lesson was that development really is a major factor, and that's clearly one of the major drivers, at least. Now, we're looking at a pretty broad period here, and based on what's happened, we think that maybe there's been a change starting around 1999 that's caused the population not to be able to recover from those hunting events. So I decided to take a look at just a more recent period, 2001 to 2017, and that creates a bit different model. We still have elk population and development as strong predictors, so that's not surprising. What's interesting is we've got some new factors. Number of cows killed. Well, now that's not too surprising because obviously that directly reduces population. And it also, because we're talking about cows specifically, it means there's fewer calves likely to be born. So, it's pretty clear how that's going to press the growth rate down. So now we have hunting starting to come in a little bit. The next piece is that summer habitat fragmentation, as opposed to just general habitat fragmentation, starts to become a real factor. And that's surprising. We always think of winter habitat as being the limitation on elk. So what's the explanation for that? Well, I'm going to guess that's what's going on is that by 2000, that winter habitat had been pretty thoroughly fragmented. Anything else that happened there just really couldn't reduce its value as habitat much more. So summer habitat, which is where elk go to fatten up for the winter, and especially that year's calves need to fatten up. If that suffers a decrease, then there's going to be really negative consequences for the elk. Maybe the most interesting thing is that the number of hunting licenses issued, completely apart from how many elk were killed in the harvest or what sex of elk or what age range of elk is killed, just the issuing more licenses had an independent effect. So something about having more people in the forest at that time of year is driving the growth rate down. And that, of course, leads me to wonder, well, how many more people are not accounted for in this model because of all the people recreating in the woods? What are they doing? This model has gone up from 70% to 80% in terms of covering the causes of change, but there's got to be something in that remaining 20%. And I'm starting to think, well, maybe it's recreation. So here's that original model again with those three areas of human impact, really actually just two, but happening in different places. Now, after doing the analysis, I'm thinking there's some other human impacts going on, maybe recreation. And I had some theories as to how that might be affecting the elk. And one is just limiting access to calving areas, or also making seasonal habitat less hospitable. And then maybe there's some actual effects on cow fertility, and that's a little more direct. So what does recreation do? How is it really affecting the elk, apart from just the fragmentation by those trails? Well, here's a photo that I think encapsulates the problem pretty well. This is from a Yellowstone area newspaper, and this is the caption that appeared with it. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think this elk is relatively undisturbed. I think it's pretty disturbed. It's standing still, which is not something an elk in the winter wants to be doing. It wants to be feeding, or at least moving towards a feeding location. And it's also got a very alert posture. You can see those ears cocked forward. It's pretty stressed. And and how could it not be? I mean, if you're standing on a trail and there's snowmobiles flying by, it's a little stressful even for a person. I can imagine if you're an elk. So I can think of a number of ways that this could be affecting the population growth rate. One is more people in the forest means maybe elk are less likely to engage in mating activities. And if they do, maybe there's less chance of it leading to pregnancy. Both of these, I'd say, are mostly related to stress. Really, all of these factors are. You might also be saying more miscarriages due to maternal food stress. If female elk are unable to feed on their own schedule, we're going to see a higher rate of miscarriages. And then once the calves are born, we're going to perhaps see a lower survival rate because those stressed cows aren't feeding well enough to produce sufficient milk. Or after weaning, maybe those calves are suffering stress and aren't feeding as successfully either. So that's a great theory, but what actually is going on with reproductive success over time? Well, good question. So wildlife managers like to use the number of calves per cow, which gets measured in this area in January each year, as an indicator of reproductive success. Because as we recall, each cow can have one calf per year. They almost never have multiple births. So the highest possible ratio is 1. Every cow is accompanied by a surviving calf. So the closer to 1 that ratio is, the better the chance that the population is going to increase in the next year. And it also, of course, helps long-term growth because roughly 50% of those calves are cows themselves and will begin reproducing. But it's not an ideal world, and not all of the calves make it. So if I look at the rates between 1981 and 2018, I saw that that percentage of cows with calves range from 25% to almost 2/3. So a pretty broad range. And that range makes a difference between a population that's in decline or a population that's growing pretty robustly. And it's not a sort of one-to-one kind of relationship again, but there's a threshold right around half of the cows having a calf, 0.48 if you're being exact. Above that level, the odds are pretty good that you're going to see a population increase the next year. If it's below that level, you're much more likely to see a decrease. So what's the trend in that kind of critical number? So those yellow years are years when that ratio is low. That means population growth is likely to decline. And you can see almost all of that is happening after 2000. So our idea that something strange has started happening around 1999 seems to be supported by this data. So what's going on though? How did that exactly result in the kind of population decline we saw? And I think what you see is there was no bounce back left. And I'll see if this video plays if you get any sound.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Okay.
So
Okay. Here, film this, Shauna. Come over here and film this.
So yeah, so Shauna verifies later that they shouldn't shoot the elk, which is good. But if you think of these elk populations as having more or less resilience, the ability to bounce back from bad years, and that's really in the terms of what their reproductive success is like. So as long as there's that resilience, elk can come back from those bad years. Trampolines are the same way, right? You can bounce on that indefinitely and it keeps pushing back. But if you put too much weight on it, too many people, it starts to lose resilience. How many people do you have to put on it before it completely loses resilience? It turns out it's 5. And I have empirical proof because a few years back, my daughter bounced up on the trampoline while 5 other children were bouncing down. And she timed it perfectly to get a big bounce and then came down just as the trampoline was stretched all the way to its lower limit by all those other kids. And she reported that it was like hitting concrete. And the ER doctor who put a cast on her broken leg agreed. And so the same thing really has happened to the elk. Throughout the 80s and the 90s, they were bearing the weight of that ever increasing development and recreation. They had enough resilience though. They were still having good reproductive success and there weren't any strong negative events. So they were able to maintain that population throughout the 90s. But while that's going on, that trampoline was getting stretched out. So when hunting was increased, there just wasn't any resilience left. The population just crashed and the new conditions of the elk being harmed by fragmentation, having to deal with increased recreation, just didn't allow them to reproduce successfully enough. So this is not about blaming, just to be clear, it's not about blaming the hunters or CPW for setting these hunting goals. Really any stress that could have come along, a really bad weather year, disease could have triggered the decline. It was more or less inevitable that it was going to happen at some point. So where does that leave us? Well, the good news is that the elk population in the Roaring Fork and Eagle Valleys does seem to have stabilized. And there's growing local support there to prevent further declines. I don't think we're going to see a recovery of those former population levels, but hopefully they'll be able to stop the decline. The other good news, is since here we're talking about the Western Slope and other parts of the state, these areas are sort of decades behind my study area in terms of the degree of development and the amount of recreation that's going on. So there's still time to avoid the mistakes that happened in the Roaring Fork and Eagle Valleys. There's an opportunity to take action now, really manage development and recreation in a way that's going to avoid loving these wild places to death. And Elizabeth said, well, can you tell us what we can do to help? And I know right now this seems like a slightly strange thing to be saying, but tell your elected officials. That's really the single best thing you can do is really engage with them, because those mayors and the county commissioners on the Western Slope, and indeed in most of the state outside of the really urban areas, they actually have a lot of power to make real changes to the development policies in their areas. And believe it or not, the federal and state agencies really do listen to the requests from these elected officials. They carry weight. So you should be letting your mayors, county commissioners, state representatives, state senators, and even members of Congress, let them know that you're concerned. Tell them what you think needs to be done. And yes, environmental advocacy groups like Endangered Species Coalition are doing a great job advocating, but frankly, the officials at these agencies find it pretty easy to ignore these groups because they're not necessarily their constituents. So this is a case where ordinary citizens can actually make a real difference. So I really encourage you to get involved, especially in local politics, where I think just a few voices can make a big difference. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, or at least for coming online. And thanks for being such a welcoming audience. And I also want to say thanks to Rocky Mountain Wild and to Patagonia, both of whom provided funding to make my research possible. And Elizabeth, I don't know what the timing's like, but I'm happy to take questions if there's time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. That was really interesting. Thank you for walking us through all that. That map showing the sort of tree roots overlays with the fragmentation, the development was pretty memorable, I think. And the chat's been pretty lively.
Hey.
Clearly, this is an issue that touches a lot of us, the nerves of a lot of us. I want to single out that someone who actually left said that she is on her county, and she's in La Plata County, the Living with Wildlife board of her county. Paul, can you tell us anything about counties and boards that have Living with Wildlife groups?
So I don't have a lot of in-depth knowledge on the politics side. Actually, Haley is perhaps more qualified to talk about that issues because I know she gets engaged in coalition building with these groups. But I'll say, for example, in Summit County, where we're really trying to improve wildlife crossings, there's been a great coalition built of nonprofit groups, county agencies, state agencies, federal agencies. And when they come together, things can actually happen. And so I don't have insider knowledge of the ins and outs of these different groups, but and of course they are gonna vary depending on exactly where you are. But it's definitely worth seeking those people out and finding out, because oftentimes some of these boards will be looking for people. They don't always have an easy time finding the people they need to be on them. So be there.
Okay. You also said earlier that part of the challenge here is that there isn't enough data about what's going on with, say, recreation, gathering data about the impacts of recreation in various areas. Is there any potential for citizen scientists or projects to take this up?
That's a good question. The good news is I think the Forest Service is trying to do more. I think they would like to do more. They're facing very real budget limitations, and they have to weigh this kind of work against enforcement work and all the other things they do. So there has been some work with the Forest Service in that area, actually, working with local volunteers to monitor, in particular, seasonal trail closures. Certain trails get closed, as I think most people here know, during winter sort of during the winter season, if it's in winter habitat, or in the spring and into summer and in production areas. So they have involved local volunteers in monitoring those closures and seeing if people are actually following them. And I've actually been talking to some folks at the Forest Service and Rocky Mountain Wild, and looks like there's going to be some small level research done, sort of looking at how many people are violating closures on selected trails and trying to understand what the actual impact of that is on the wildlife. So at the same time, sort of seeing if people obey them and also seeing how effective are they. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think there is room for that, but someone's got to take the lead on organizing that.
Okay, that is true. And as far as enforcement of those rules go, one of the participants says, we're having a terrible time with bikers, mountain and e-bikes, especially e-bikes. The riders go off trail. We don't have anyone to, quote, force them to follow guidelines. So that certainly goes to the heart of a lot of this, I would think, no?
It does. I mean, of course, it's going to depend, who manages the land in question. But I will say that, almost all the public lands, the people who are, enforcing these kinds of closures and rules are stretched pretty thin. And I know some of the volunteers in White River National Forest have been at trailheads of closed trails to talk to people who come and show up and are planning to use the trails and explain to them why they're closed, and are able to also suggest alternative locations where they can engage in the same activity, places that are nearby that are still open. So hopefully there can be more of that kind of education, given that I don't see a huge chance in the resources for enforcement increasing. It would be great if they did.
So like a leave no trace sort of education push.
Something like that.
Okay, Cool. There are a couple of participants who had elk specific questions, so I'm just going to single them out. One is Hazel Gordon. Hazel, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question? And the person after Hazel is Alex Marks. So Hazel, please unmute yourself and ask your question of Paul, if you are here. If you are still here. Are you still here, Hazel? Oh, maybe Hazel's not here. Okay, well, Hazel did ask, do you think there might be a differential gender-based mortality issue in which males with higher nutritional needs than females are not getting what they need and become lost to the general population?
I'm going to say I don't know. I'm an ecologist. I'm not a biologist. You would want someone with that kind of expertise. It's certainly possible. I mean, I think, when we're thinking of elk populations generally, we're thinking that the number of females is the more important factor, because obviously each female can only have one calf per year, and the males can obviously fertilize multiple females. But there are other consequences of changing herd structures and age structures that maybe are a little more subtle, but could be very real. And I would that's one for the conservation biologist to answer.
Right. Okay. Alex. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Excuse me.
Oh, that's a good question.
It is good. Okay. Alex Marks, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question about the wolf reintroduction?
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm Alex Marks. I live in Evergreen, Colorado, and I just want to say thank you for that wonderful presentation. But I had no idea that the elk population had been decimated so much over the past 20 years. I'm a big advocate of the wolf reintroduction plan on the Western Slope. And I know one of the big arguments was because of the overabundance of elk that were on the Western Slope, but that could be a counter argument now. How could that hinder this reintroduction proposal?
Well, what I would say is my study area and the areas where wolf introduction is proposed are different areas. So that's not a very good indicator. The fact that elk in that area have been under pressure doesn't necessarily mean that elk in other areas, or for that matter, mule deer in other areas, are under the same pressures. One thing I would say about Colorado is that every area is really different. So even while this area of the state was having pretty substantial declines, other areas were having pretty substantial increases in elk population. So you have to look, I think, at a more localized level. And I've not been directly involved in wolf reintroduction or analyzing those areas, so I can't give you a more definitive opinion than that. But I don't think this study particularly argues one way or the other.
Rhonda Dern comments that there are 750,000 deer and elk in Colorado, plenty of deer and elk for the gray wolves.
Yeah, if you're looking at a statewide basis, the numbers are large and tend to do reasonably well. You really do have to look at a more local basis. Some areas are affected much more by chronic wasting disease and other factors, and so yeah, you can't just say, oh, well, this area indicates what's going to happen in another area.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'd like to just tell Linda Hilo if she'd like to make her comment aloud. Linda, would you like to contribute what you put in the chat and tell us about your situation in your area? You've done mute yourself. Oh, okay.
Yeah, actually, I've spent the last 2 days on the Custer Gallatin. I'm from Billings, Montana, and I work with Great Broads in Bozeman. And the Custer Gallatin Forest Plan is in the objection phase. And so the last 2 days, well, it'll go on tomorrow. Tomorrow's wildlife. Anyway, well, actually it's bison, today was wildlife. But what has happened is there's enough pressure from the mountain bike community that they went into collaboration with some other large wilderness groups. And they've actually gone as far in the forest plan as to release part of a wilderness study area. They're recommending they want to change it to something called a backcountry area. And we've seen what's happened to the elk and the animal populations in another backcountry area called the Elkhorn. It's in the Lewis and Clark National Forest. But what we see with mountain bikes in Highlight Porcupine Buffalo Horn, which is this wonderful wilderness study area that borders Yellowstone. Olis Miri and God, who else? They said it probably should be part of the park because it's such wonderful habitat. It's not rock and ice. It's where the elk population's wonderful. It's part of a migration corridor. There's grizzlies, there's wolves, there's wolverine, there's lynx. And they want to cut that in half because it's across the road from Big Sky and the Yellowstone Club and all of these super wealthy developments. And they want to use it as their playground. So there's lots of mountain biking back in there. They kind of ignore whatever laws, but the Forest Service has been sued a number of times too, saying if it's a wilderness study area, you're supposed to keep it in a condition that could be, you know, designated wilderness at some point, and it's kind of been in limbo. But I mean, social media is very interesting nowadays because we'll hear snowmobilers bragging that a grizzly couldn't get them because they go by their dens too fast on snowmobiles. So it's really awful for habitat. And actually we do have wolves here, and they tend to clean up chronic wasting a bit, they think. And the nice thing about hiking around wolves is they don't want anything to do with humans. They really want to get out of there. Grizzlies are far more something you'd be thinking about, I guess. But anyway, we have a heck of a problem. I wish we could bring Paul to talk to every county commissioner in the state, because what you're doing is really important. You're going to publish this?
Well, we'll see. Publication is potentially in the works, but what I'd really rather do is actually have a chance to do more research. But fortunately, that's not in the cards right now. I'm actually going to be moving into some different areas right now. But I hope more work gets done in this area because, and I think there will be, because as you say, recreation is a huge issue right now. And you know, the events of the last year, I think have, you know, probably if we had the numbers to back it up, have probably increased the recreational pressure on these areas. And so it's a good time to rethink how we're using them. And I see Roz McCullen waving her hand at me.
Hi, Paula, good work. That was tremendous. I'm just typing up a chat. But is there a way to make this available on the web permanently? So a link that people can refer to and get this exact same presentation?
That is actually a question for Elizabeth and for Haley. I certainly don't have any objection.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, glad you don't object, Paul. Yes, we will be putting it on the YouTube.
Yeah, I know. And there are other versions of this talk that are actually already on there because I've given this a few times for different organizations. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard. And, you know, I think right now a lot of people view mountain bikers and e-bikers as the problem. And I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think they're driving a lot of the increased recreation right now. It's not to say that other kinds of recreation don't also cause problems. They're just not maybe in the forefront right now.
Yes.
So I think what it really shows is the need for more research, and also you know, maybe we need to take the approach of it until we have a little more research. Maybe we need to be a little more conservative in opening up new areas to new activities, because it's very hard, you know, as I'm sure a lot of people on this call know, to go back once areas have been opened up. It's very hard to turn it around.
Great, thank you, Paul. Roz, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, I actually just sent it on the chat, but this month or early December, there's going to be a release of a very exciting report that is a update of a handbook produced by the Trails Program, the State Trails Program 20 years ago, called Planning Trails with Wildlife in Mind. And it's been a long time in the making, and it has some of CPW's Parks and Wildlife's best thinking on planning trails to avoid the impacts that Paul discussed. And what I said in my chat was, can anybody here receive email addresses from people who want to get on that comment list? Oh, great. So Elizabeth, can you,
Sure.
I'll send you how do I get my email to you?
I will email you. Or I'll just put my email in the chat.
Oh, well, I'm actually not wanting to get too many emails, but I think I have Haley. Haley, you've got my email, don't you? Can you send me, yeah.
Okay.
Send me what I need, and I'll send you what you need, and then we'll go it from there.
Okay, that sounds good. And we're going a few minutes over, which I'm hoping is okay. I wanted to get to Craig Grother's comment. So Craig, could you tell us? Or did you leave?
Certainly, thank you.
Okay, good.
You hear me?
Yes.
This has to do with the elk populations in the state. And Parks and Wildlife actually just wrote a report, 2020 status report of big game and populations in Colorado. And kind of the bottom line there is, you know, the elk populations south of Interstate 70 are pretty much below the population objectives that they've come up with that are management plans, particularly in Southwest Colorado. It's really dismal. And then north of I-70, they're either at or slightly above the management objectives. And in that report, they kind of basically go through the same impacts that Paul described. Development was a huge impact on our elk herds and other wildlife for that matter. And recreation was like number 2. So, you know, if you haven't seen that report, Paul, you should check it out.
No, I actually have looked at that. And no, I mean, I think the good news is I think CPW and also the Forest Service are taking these issues seriously. And hopefully that's gonna result in actions. I mean, that's really the key is I think they are increasingly recognizing the problem. And I think that, you know, maybe they had been setting hunting targets, I think based on old assumptions about how elk populations recover and maybe not fully taking into account factors like development and recreation. And hopefully they'll be able to you know, take this kind of information and set more realistic targets. Obviously, and this would be a discussion for another time. It's always a little bit problematic when the agency charged with setting hunting targets gets a very substantial part of its funding from hunting license sales. And you know, that obviously puts them in a bit of a bind. But hopefully, I know there's really good biologists at those agencies, and hopefully management listens to them.
I wonder if Craig could send that link to Elizabeth, who would then be able to send it to all of us on the call.
Yeah, no problem, Roz. I could certainly do that.
Okay, good. And everybody, we're going to send out a follow-up to this webinar with the link to the YouTube. We can include whatever other information that people feel registrants would benefit from. So please, you know, just send it along and we'll send that out in probably a number of days. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up. Paul, terrific presentation. Do you have any closing comment for us before we sign off?
Not really, other than thank you all for being so interested, and clearly a lot of you passionate about these issues. I think engaged people on the ground is really is what can make the differences, and that's, you know, keep up the good work.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us and putting all this together with us for us. We really enjoyed having you, and we'll be thinking of you as we're out in the field recreating and hopefully. Everybody, if you, before you sign off, you want to drop in the chat where you like to recreate on the Western Slope, we'd be interested to see your favorite places. So that's up to you though. And so I'll keep this open for a couple minutes. I will say goodnight to Paul, and thank you again, Paul.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and thank you, Rocky Mountain Wild, for bringing Paul to us, one of our many coalition partners. So I hope everyone gets out and about in the coming holiday season, as it were, and we'll see you maybe in January for our spotlight with Kenyon Fields of the Western Landowners Alliance. So maybe you'll join us then. Okay. Good night, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Good night, everybody.